Alright, so in this video I will be explaining the GRE structure to you guys, just giving you a macro view of how the GRE is structured, how the new GRE basically is, how many questions it has, what type of questions it has, what you should be doing, anything from the structure that you should be taking away, etc., etc. Let's go ahead. So once you start the GRE test, you get the essay writing session, which is basically called the Analytical Writing Assessment section on the GRE. You're given an issue task, or basically you are given to analyze an issue, which you have to do within 30 minutes. It is scaled on a score of 0 to 6, so you can get a minimum of 0, you can get a maximum of 6, and the increments are done in half points, which basically means you can get 1, or you can get 1.5, you can get 2, you can get 2.5. It's not like you jump from 2 to directly 3. You can get a 2.5 as well, is what I meant to say. Then you will have a teeny tiny 1-minute break, and although the GRE is now much shorter, it's literally half the length of what it used to be, I still recommend you utilizing every break that you get. Like for instance, in this 1-minute tiny break, you would just be shown the instructions on the screen, which you would already know after taking like 3 or 4 mock exams. So you do not need those instructions anyway. However, what you can do is you can just sit down, relax, do some belly breathing, which really disengages your animal brain, which is responsible for anxiety, your reptilian mammalian brain, and engages your frontal cortex, lowers your cortisol, and basically helps you, perform better on the GRE. You might think that, okay, this is like hocus pocus placebo. This is actual science, and this actually works with students on the GRE. And I have been teaching so many of them that I've lost count of students who have used this and added 2 or 3 extra points. All right, then what I call the block 1 would appear. I call it block 1 because we get one section of quantitative reasoning, which is basically GRE math, and then you get another subsection of verbal reasoning, which is basically GRE English. For both of these, you would have 12 questions. And though it seems from the timings that I've written on screen that you might have 1.75 minutes per question on quant and 1.5 minutes per question for verbal, but that is not the case. We will go into the depth of that later. Let's just come back to what we were discussing, which is after the essay you will have a tiny break, which I strongly recommend you to take, and then a quant section and verbal section. And I've put it these double-headed arrows because they can swap places. It's quite possible that I take the test, and after my essay the first thing I see is a quant section. It's quite possible that you take the test and the first section that you see after the writing assessment section is the verbal reasoning section. Then you will again have a teeny tiny break, and the next block, I call it the next block because it has different number of questions. Like this time around, each quant and verbal will have more questions, 3 extra questions, and the total number of questions would be 15. One thing that I would like to mention is that both the quantitative reasoning and the verbal reasoning sections are scored on a scale of 130 to 170. So 130 on the GRE is basically a 0, right? If you just leave the questions, leave the whole exam empty without attempting any quant or any verbal question, you will get a 130, which is basically GRE's way of saying that you belong in the living, breathing list of graduates, at least, right? Okay, but yeah, it's a 0 technically. One thing I would like to tell you more is that GRE is section adaptive. What does that mean? So the quant section that you would get in block 1 would affect the quant section that you would get in block 2. How so? Well, if you perform really well on the quant section in block 1, your quant section on block 2 would be really difficult, right? And that's a very good thing, because again, no one knows how the exact algorithm of GRE works, but then people have theories, and the one theory that does the best job of explaining why performing on the first section of quant, or verbal for that matter, is super necessary to get a good score is the bracket theory. So the bracket theory basically says that a student who performs really well on the first section of quant, for example, would be put into a score bracket. Like for example, if I get 12 out of 12 questions correct on the first section, the algorithm would put me in a bracket of 164 to 170 for quant, right? Remember how quant and both verbal are scored on a scale of 130 to 170. So yeah, the algorithm would put me in a bracket of 164 to 170. That this test taker belongs in this bracket, and where I fall in that bracket is determined by my second section, right? So a lot of students, like for example, if there's student A who gets 10 out of 12 questions correct on the first section, and then 5 out of 15 correct on the second section, and then there's a student B who gets, let's say, 7 out of 12 questions correct on the first section, and then 8 out of 15 questions correct on the second section. Now if you look at the total of them, both have correctly answered 15 questions overall on quant, but the score of student A would most probably be a point or two higher, right? Again, why? Because student A would encounter more difficult questions in the second section. More of his questions were correct in the first one. So if you use the bracket theory to explain what's going on, he was probably put into a higher score bracket. Cannot emphasize it enough. Take all breaks. Do that deep belly breathing thing that I told you about earlier. You would have a break after the essay section. You would have a break between the two sections in the first block. You would have a break once you're done with the second section of the first block, right? And then again you would have a break between the two sections in the second block. Basically, whenever one section ends, you have a 1-minute break that I strongly recommend you to take. And then ultimately your test would end, which is going to take a total of around 1 hour 58 minutes approximately. But yeah, if there's one thing that I would want to emphasize on again and again and again, is that getting your first section right or on point matters a lot, right? So even when you are taking your mock exams, I want you to summon a different level of focus and performance for the easy to medium type of questions that you would encounter in the first section of quant and verbal, right? Try to get your accuracy as high as possible on those type of questions so you are put in a higher score bracket.